The air in the dining room had always felt thin when she was around, a palpable tension that settled in the back of my throat like dust. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, the thin air had crackled. As she spewed her venom, her gaze fixed not on my face, but on the untouched plate of artisanal cheese I'd spent all afternoon preparing, she delivered the blow. "Honestly, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine condescension only years of privilege could cultivate, "just be quiet. Be the accountant. You're good with numbers, aren't you? Stick to that and let the adults handle things." It wasn't the first time she'd belittled me, but it was the first time it had landed with such a visceral thud, a sickening realization that this wasn't just about her usual disdain. This was about a deliberate, calculated dismissal. My breath hitched, but the practiced smile I'd honed over years of navigating these familial minefields stayed firmly in place. I simply nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of my chin, and poured myself another glass of wine, the ice clinking a little too loudly in the sudden, strained silence. My life before this particular brand of familial friction had been ordinary. Stable. I had a career I was good at, a comfortable home, and a husband who, bless him, was perpetually oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around his mother. He saw her as eccentric, perhaps a little dramatic, but never malicious. That was his blind spot, and hers. She, on the other hand, saw me as an interloper, a usurper of her long-held position as the matriarch of whatever loose assembly of people my husband's side of the family constituted. It started subtly, years ago. Little digs about my career choice, hints that it was unladylike, or that I was too focused on work to nurture a proper home. Then came the more pointed remarks, usually delivered when she thought I was out of earshot, but always with a sliver of my hearing catching the intended barb. She'd once cornered me at a family barbecue, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "You know," she'd purred, her eyes glinting, "your father-in-law always said the best wives were seen and not heard. Just something to think about, dear, as you get older." I remembered the way the humid summer air had suddenly felt suffocating, and how I'd mumbled a noncommittal reply, my cheeks burning. Another memory surfaced, sharper, more defined. It was after my grandmother passed, and the reading of the will. My husband and I were entitled to a modest inheritance, a few sentimental pieces of jewelry and a sum that, while not life-changing, would have been a nice cushion. She, of course, was the executor. The day we were supposed to receive the documents, she called, her voice unusually bright. "Oh, darling," she chirped, "such a shame about the finances. It seems there were discrepancies. Some unforeseen debts that needed settling. We had to dip into everything, you understand." The casual way she said it, as if she were discussing the weather, made my stomach clench. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that there were no debts. My grandmother had been meticulously organized. But confronting her would have been a scene, a shouting match, a drama I'd learned long ago to avoid. So, I swallowed it, the bitter taste of injustice coating my tongue, and watched her spend the next year redecorating her already opulent home with what I knew was, at least partially, my inheritance. The psychological toll wasn't a sudden breakdown, but a slow erosion, a quiet hardening of my resolve. Every dismissive comment, every entitled decree, every veiled insult chipped away at my patience, carving out a space where something else began to grow, a cold, calculating patience. And then came that night. The air, as I said, was thick with a pre-storm stillness. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me alone to host his mother, a concession I'd reluctantly agreed to, a testament to my own misguided attempts at family harmony. We were seated at the dining table, the remnants of a perfectly respectable dinner between us. She'd been complaining about her property taxes, a familiar refrain, and how the council was incompetent, how the local government was a cesspool of underachievers. It was the usual preamble to her pronouncements of superiority. She'd waved a dismissive hand, almost knocking over the expensive crystal wine glass I'd carefully selected for her. Honestly, she'd sighed, leaning back, her perfectly coiffed hair unruffled by the near disaster. It's exhausting dealing with these people. They simply don't understand nuance or proper procedure. Her eyes, hard and sharp, finally landed on me. The smile she gave me was not warm, not even polite. It was a predator's smile, a wolf's baring of teeth. You know, she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet condescending, whisper, it's like I told my little ACC. Accountant here earlier. Just be quiet. Be the accountant. You're good with numbers, aren't you? Stick to that and let the adults handle things. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The accountant wasn't a nickname, it was a label, a deliberate attempt to relegate me to a role she deemed subservient, insignificant, and silent. The smugness in her eyes, the certainty that she had delivered a masterful put-down, was almost unbearable. In that moment, the slow erosion stopped. The dam broke. A tidal wave of cold fury, meticulously contained for years, began to recede, revealing something hard and unyielding beneath. I felt a strange calm descend, a clarity that cut through the years of passive endurance. I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the polished hardwood floor. She looked up, a flicker of surprise, then annoyance crossing her face. Going somewhere, dear? She asked, her tone laced with suspicion. I didn't answer. I simply walked out of the dining room, through the hushed hallway, and into my home office. The room was my sanctuary, filled with the quiet hum of my computer and the orderly stacks of files that represented my actual profession. I sat down at my desk, my hands steady on the keyboard. I didn't storm out, I didn't yell, I didn't smash anything. I simply opened a specific folder, a folder I hadn't accessed in months, a folder that held documents I'd meticulously compiled, documented, and saved, purely out of an instinct that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with her. It contained copies of her property tax statements for the last 5 years, cross-referenced with her declared income and the assessed value of her properties. It also contained a few discreetly acquired pieces of information from neighbors, subtle observations about her frequent, often extravagant, purchases that seemed unsupported by her official financial statements. And crucially, it contained a detailed, annotated timeline of events surrounding my grandmother's will, including discrepancies I'd flagged years ago but had dismissed as my own overthinking. I began typing, not an angry email, but a formal, concise request. I attached scanned copies of the relevant documents. I outlined, in precise, unemotional language, the anomalies I had discovered, the potential discrepancies, the questions that needed to be answered. I addressed it not to her, but to the regional tax authority and to the estate division of the local courthouse. My fingers moved with a quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil that had simmered for so long. I reread each sentence, ensuring it was factual, devoid of speculation, and legally sound. I didn't accuse, I merely presented facts and requested clarification, an audit, an investigation. I hit send. A small chime confirmed the email had been dispatched. Then, I stood up and went back to the dining room. She was still there, sipping her wine, looking impatient. I walked over to the table and placed a single, folded piece of paper in front of her. It was a copy of the email I had just sent, but printed out, with the recipient list clearly visible. Her eyes scanned it, confusion warring with dawning comprehension. The smugness that had adorned her face just minutes before began to crumble, replaced by a flicker of something akin to panic. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled as she reached for the paper, her gaze darting from the printed words to my face, searching for a crack in my composure. But she found none. I simply met her gaze, a quiet, unwavering stare that held the weight of years of silent endurance, and then I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the cold, hard reality I had just unleashed. The next few days were a symphony of chaos, but it was a chaos happening entirely outside my direct experience. My husband, bless his oblivious heart, called me in a panic. The tax office? An audit? Mom's on the phone, she's hysterical. He couldn't understand how this had happened, how his eccentric mother was suddenly in deep trouble. Then came the barrage of texts from her loyal sycophants, the distant cousins and former acquaintances who had always benefited from her largesse. How could you do this? One read. You've ruined her reputation. Another, your husband is beside himself. You need to apologize immediately. But the true fallout was in the deafening silence that followed. Her calls went unanswered. The frantic voicemails were deleted without being listened to. The social media posts from her usual circle, which usually chronicled her lavish lifestyle, suddenly went dark. The property tax authorities' investigation, sparked by my precise documentation, unearthed not just financial irregularities, but also proof of undeclared income from various sources, including some questionable offshore accounts that had, coincidentally, been mentioned in a hushed conversation I'd overheard at a family gathering years ago. The unforeseen debts, had conveniently swallowed my inheritance. They turned out to be nothing more than her own extravagant spending habits, disguised as a necessity. The judgment against her was swift and absolute. Fines, back taxes, penalties that far outweighed the original inheritance. Her reputation, the one she guarded so fiercely, was not just tarnished, it was irrevocably shattered. The adults she'd so proudly claimed to be were, in fact, a facade, built on a foundation of deceit and entitlement. My role as accountant had been to quietly manage numbers, to be precise, to be factual. And that, I realized with a chilling sense of finality, was precisely what I had done. There was no joy in it, no sense of triumph in the conventional sense. Just a quiet, undeniable resolution. The air in my own home, finally, felt thin no more. It felt clear, and it felt mine.